Formula One, it's the pinnacle of motorsport, isn't it? A glorious, noisy, and sometimes utterly bonkers spectacle. But it wasn't always about carbon fiber spaceships and computer-controlled everything. Oh no. Back in the beginning, in the 1950s, things were much, much simpler, and by simpler, I mean more dangerous. The cars were basically metal tubes with an engine strapped to the front, 4 skinny tires, and a steering wheel the size of a dustbin lid. The driver sat bolt upright, exposed to the elements, with nothing more than a leather helmet and some goggles for protection. It was pure, raw, and utterly terrifying. These early machines were beautiful in their own way, like polished cigars on wheels. Think of the Alfa Romeo 158 or the legendary Mercedes-Benz W196. They had long bonnets to house enormous roaring engines right in front of the driver. There was no thought of aerodynamics. The idea was just to make the engine as powerful as possible and hope for the best. The tires were thin, like something you'd find on a bicycle, which meant the cars slid around corners in a wonderful balletic dance. It was all about mechanical grip and the sheer bravery of the man behind the wheel wrestling this beast. Safety, you ask? What safety? There were no seat belts, no roll cages, no crumple zones. The fuel tanks were often just containers sitting right next to the driver, ready to turn a small crash into a massive fireball. The tracks themselves were just country roads with a few hay bales scattered about for decoration, or rather, protection. The drivers were heroes, gladiators in tweed jackets. They knew the risks were colossal. They drove with a level of courage you just don't see anymore, because every single corner could genuinely be their last. It was a different world, a different kind of racing. Comparing these early cars to today's machines is like comparing a carrier pigeon to a fighter jet. The focus was entirely on the engine and the chassis. They were heavy, cumbersome beasts that demanded immense physical strength to control. The steering was heavy, the brakes were questionable at best, and the suspension was rudimentary. Yet from these simple, brutal beginnings, the seeds of a technological revolution were sown. The quest for speed had begun, and it would change the face of motorsport forever, pushing engineers to think, to invent, and to create the monsters we see today. Then came the swinging 60s, and everything changed. Suddenly engineers realized that just having a massive engine wasn't enough. A chap named Colin Chapman at Lotus had a brilliant idea: make the car lighter. But the truly game-changing moment was when someone decided to stick wings on a racing car. It was genius. They realized that if you shaped a car like an upside-down aeroplane wing, the air rushing over it would push it down onto the track. This invisible force, called downforce, meant the car had more grip. More grip meant you could go through corners much, much faster. At first, the wings were hilarious. They were stuck on tall, wobbly stilts high above the car, looking completely ridiculous and, as it turned out, being incredibly dangerous. They often broke, sending cars spearing off the track at biblical speeds. But the principle was sound. Soon the wings were integrated properly into the car's design, with a front wing and a rear wing becoming standard. Car shapes started to transform from cigars into sharp, aggressive wedges. The engine also moved from the front to behind the driver, which gave the cars much better balance and handling. It was a proper revolution. The 1970s took this aerodynamic obsession to a whole new level of brilliant madness. Lotus again came up with something called ground effect. They designed the entire underside of the car to act like one enormous wing, effectively sucking the car to the tarmac. Cars like the Lotus 79 were so dominant it was almost unfair. Drivers experienced G-forces they had never felt before, putting immense strain on their necks and bodies. The cars looked menacing, often painted in the colors of cigarette sponsors, and they sounded absolutely fantastic, with the wail of the Cosworth DFV engine becoming the soundtrack of a generation. Of course, with all this new speed came new dangers. The cars were getting faster, but safety was still struggling to catch up. Drivers were now strapped in and roll hoops were introduced. But the ground effect cars had a nasty habit. If their seal with the ground was broken for even a split second over a bump, they would suddenly lose all their grip and become an unguided missile. It was a thrilling but perilous era. The cars were wild, untamed beasts, and the drivers who mastered them, like Niki Lauda and James Hunt, became legends. This was the era that truly defined F1's blend of genius engineering and breathtaking risk. If the 70s were about grip, the 1980s were all about one thing: power. And I mean stupendous, mind-altering, earth-shattering power. This was the dawn of the turbo era. Engineers figured out how to bolt a turbocharger to a tiny 1.5-litre engine and squeeze an absurd amount of horsepower out of it. In qualifying, some of these engines were producing well over 1,000 horsepower. To put that in perspective, that's more power than you got in a Bugatti Veyron, but in a car that weighed less than a small garden shed. It was completely and utterly unhinged. These turbo monsters were brutal to drive. The power delivery was not smooth. Nothing would happen for a few seconds, and then bang! The turbo would kick in and the car would explode forward with the ferocity of a rocket. It took incredible skill to tame these machines. Drivers had to anticipate the power surge, getting on the throttle before the corner's apex just to be ready for the onslaught. The cars spat flames from their exhausts and sounded like angry gods gargling thunder. It was an epic, loud, and frankly quite terrifying spectacle, the absolute peak of raw, untamed F1 power. But it wasn't just about brute force. The 1980s and 90s also saw the quiet invasion of the microchip. Computers started creeping into the cockpit. First came digital dashboards, replacing old analog dials with bright futuristic numbers. Then came the really clever stuff, active suspension. The car's computers could read the track surface and adjust the suspension in real time, keeping the car perfectly flat and stable through corners. This technology, pioneered by Williams, made the cars unbelievably fast and consistent. It was like they were driving on rails. This technological arms race continued into the 1990s. We got semi-automatic gearboxes where drivers could change gears just by flicking a paddle on the steering wheel without ever taking their hands off it. We got traction control, which stopped the wheels from spinning under acceleration. All these driver aids made the cars easier to drive on the limit, but it also sparked a huge debate. Was the technology taking over? Was the driver becoming less important? The governing body thought so and eventually banned most of these electronic aids, trying to put the control back into the hands of the human behind the wheel. And that brings us to the modern era, to the year 2025. If you think the cars of the 80s were complex, they are abacuses compared to the supercomputers we see on the grid today. The biggest change has been the engine. The screaming V8S and V10S are gone. In their place, we have something called a power unit. It's an incredibly complicated 1.6-litre V6 turbo engine, but it's also a hybrid. It has powerful electric motors that harvest energy when the car is braking, store it in a battery, and then deploy it for a massive boost of extra horsepower. It is a staggering piece of engineering. The shape of the cars has also been sculpted by thousands of hours in a wind tunnel and on a computer. Every single surface, every curve, and every tiny winglet is designed with one purpose: to manipulate the air. The cars are longer and wider than ever before, with incredibly complex front and rear wings that look like they belong on a fighter jet. The goal is still downforce, but now it's managed with a precision that would have been unimaginable a few decades ago. These cars generate so much aerodynamic grip that they could, in theory, drive upside down in the tunnel at high speed. The feel of driving one of these things is completely alien to what those heroes in the 50s experienced. The drivers lie almost flat on their backs, looking out of a tiny cockpit slot. They are protected by the halo, a titanium structure around their head that can withstand the weight of a double-decker bus. The steering wheel is no longer just for steering. It's a command center with dozens of buttons and switches controlling everything from the engine mode to the brake balance. Driving an F1 car today is as much a mental challenge as it is a physical one. So, why does all this evolution matter? Because it's the story of human ingenuity. It shows our relentless desire to go faster, to be smarter, to push the boundaries of what's possible. For the drivers, it has made the sport incredibly demanding, but also infinitely safer. For the fans, it provides a stunning spectacle. Watching these technological marvels battle it out at over 200 miles per hour is pure theatre. The cars have changed beyond all recognition, from brutal cigar tubes to hybrid spaceships. But the spirit of Formula One, the quest for the ultimate speed, remains exactly the same, and that is brilliant.